that people can't afford, right? So we did talk about that. So when there is something that people can't afford, let's say a basic necessity or something, right? Then what solution government usually use to overcome that problem? That was maximum prices, right? So we did talk about maximum prices. In fact, we also looked at the graph. We saw how maximum prices help solve the problem of affordability, right? Do you remember? Then after that, we also talked about the idea of minimum prices. Now, what are minimum prices? Minimum prices are imposed to help producer. So minimum prices, unlike maximum prices benefit consumers, whereas minimum prices benefits uh, producers, right? Because in minimum price, the price is above the equilibrium. In minimum price, the price is above equilibrium price. Government sets price above equilibrium price. And for maximum price, it is below equilibrium price. People, do you remember? Right? Above equilibrium price and minimum price is below equilibrium price. Then in the other class, which I forgot to answer, Zuhan, you asked me a question. There are two other words for these two concepts, right? So let me write those for you. And maximum prices below the equilibrium price, right? Okay, now we also call these prices as price ceiling and price floor. What is ceiling, right? So you would already be familiar with the word floor and ceiling, right? Now think about this. Which of the two would be floor and which of the two will be ceiling? Let me explain that, but it will be more helpful if we look through the graph. Okay, now think about this. So how is equilibrium reached in any market? So equilibrium in the market is reached where the demand and supply for a product are equal, right? So you have quantity of the good on the x-axis, right? And you have price of that product on the y-axis, where its demand and supply intersect. That is where the market equilibrium is, right? So downward sloping is always the demand for a product. Upward sloping is always the supply for the good, right? Where the two are equal. So upward sloping is market supply, downward sloping is market demand. Where the two intersect, that is market equilibrium. What it shows us is equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, right? So it shows us how much will be the equilibrium price for the good and how much will be the equilibrium quantity. Any confusion, right? So P1 will be the equilibrium price, Q1 will be the equilibrium quantity. Okay. Now, maximum price, think about this, students. Maximum price shows that the price cannot be more than this. Max means that this is the maximum that producers can charge. So maximum price has to be below the equilibrium. This is the maximum price. Anything below is fine. Anything below max, what does maximum means, right? Anything below is fine, but above is not acceptable, right? And this is also known as, maximum price is also known as price ceiling, right? Now, this is the maximum, just a second, I always get this confused. Price ceiling, no, this is price, just a second, this is getting confusing. Ceiling, yeah, that's what I'm thinking about. Price, maximum price. Anything below is fine, but more is not fine. Price ceiling. Yeah, this should be price ceiling. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, price ceiling, right? Because what is ceiling? Ceiling is, the roof of a room, right? So anything below is fine. Anything above that is not fine. So that's this price ceiling, right? On the other hand, students, you have to ask me the question. If there's anything confusing, you have to stop me and ask me there and then, right? Now, what is price? Minimum price, as I said, minimum price is above the equilibrium. Why? Because it is to help the producers. It is to benefit the producers. And anything above this price is fine. Anything below this price is not fine. So this is price floor, right? So this is floor. Anything above this is fine. Anything below this is not fine. Students, are you following me? Right? Because what is the floor? Floor is where you are standing. Anything above this is fine. Anything below is not fine, right? So price floor, right? Right. Not in the class. I'll send you a voice message. Don't worry about it. Okay. Let me quickly confirm that price ceiling. I'm pretty sure I wrote it correctly, but it's always good to be. Price ceiling is a government imposed price control limit on how high a price is charged for a product. Yeah, that's correct. So maximum price is price ceiling and minimum price is price floor, right? Limit on how low a price can be charged. Yeah, that's correct. Right? We good on this, students? Any confusion? Anything that's not clear, right? Okay. Do remember that minimum prices are there to benefit producers, whereas maximum prices are there to benefit consumers, right? Because think about this, if government is setting a price below the equilibrium price, obviously who will benefit? Because previously, if let's say people were paying 100 rupees per kg per unit of the good, now it is somewhat 80 because this is below equilibrium. So obviously it will be something less than 100 rupees. So obviously who benefits? Consumers, right? So it's benefiting the consumers. And in the case of minimum prices, who benefits? Producers. Why? Because again, you can see previously, if the price was 100 rupees per unit, and now this price level, minimum price level, is above the equilibrium price, so it will be something more than 100, right? So let's say 120, 150. So obviously, who gets to benefit? Producers, because now they are receiving more compensation for the same good. Okay, now we'll move forward in supply side policies. Not really, not really, Zohan. So supply side policies, we'll come to it in Unit 5. In Unit 5, we'll talk about macroeconomic policies, and then we'll see that supply side policies are mainly about increasing the aggregate supply of the country, right? So supply side policies include things like, let's say, giving interest-free loans to startups, establishing industrial zones so that new businesses can start up, set up over there, then giving tax holidays. Tax holidays are basically you don't charge taxes to new businesses so that they get to establish themselves, and only after they are established they start paying taxes and things like that, right? So I mean, these are supply side policies because they encourage, or training of human labor force, right? So investment in education and healthcare is also a supply side policies because that makes your labor more productive, like what we can see in countries like China and India. What are China and India doing? Their labor is quite trained. Even in Silicon Valley, I mean, a big proportion of people, right? In all these tech startups, Facebook, Google, Amazon, right? You can see a lot of the people there are Indians and Chinese, also Pakistanis, but I mean, a vast majority of Indians and Pakistani, or Indians and Chinese, right? Even the CEO of Google is Indian, right? Are we getting this? Right? Poland, right? What is Poland? Okay. Okay, are we good on this, students? Can we move on? Okay, now we'll do a quick recap, right? We'll do a quick recap of what we did in the last class, and then we'll, move forward from there. Now think about this, indirect taxes. What are indirect taxes? I gave you detailed explanation of what indirect taxes are, right? Indirect taxes, okay, no worries. Indirect taxes are taxes that are imposed on consumption. I did explain you, right? So taxes on consumption / production, right? Now, whenever government imposes tax on a product, right, that is an indirect tax, right? Now, the way this tax is collected is that this tax will be, indirect taxes will be split between consumers and producers, because who's the one consuming? Consumers. And who's the one producing a product? Producers, right? So the tax which is imposed on a product will be always split between two groups, which are consumers and producers, right? Are we good on this? Okay. Now, to give you a little bit of an overview so that you get a better idea, if you ever go to a shop, no matter which country you live in, right? Whenever you go to shop to buy something, right? Next time, just try to read the label where you can see the prices. So it would say something like GST, or simply, general sales tax, or it will say sales tax, right? Now, what it is basically, it is the tax that the government has imposed on that product, right? Okay. Now, what's the purpose of this? Why government does that, and what objective it's trying to achieve out of it? Well, we are about to discuss that, right? Now, the idea is it's also VAT, value added tax. Yeah, value added tax. That is also an indirect tax, value added tax. Okay. On finished goods. So basically, let me tell you the difference between these two value added taxes. So the products that you will buy for yourself, the final goods that you buy, on the final goods, you will see these two taxes, right? Technically, these are the same. Either you call it general sales tax or you call it sales tax, it's the same thing. But these two are on finished goods, right? The finished goods that you buy, let's say toothpaste, toothbrush, soap, shampoo, moisturizing cream, whatever it is, right? And these are on semi finished goods, right? So on basically raw materials and things like that. So you will never get to read value added tax on products that you buy. But don't worry about it. These are also indirect taxes because these are imposed on production. Okay. Are we good on this, students? Now think about this. Now, what's the purpose of imposing an indirect tax? So if you look at the underlying reason why government imposes indirect taxes is to discourage consumption of a product. is to discourage consumption of a good. But now you might be thinking that if you're buying soap, shampoo, and things like that, and you see sales tax imposed on it, then I mean, does government want you to discourage use of soaps? Obviously not. But I'll tell you the reason why government also imposes indirect taxes on other products as well. But the main reason, right, like the primary reason for indirect tax on any good should be is to discourage consumption of that product, and therefore it should be ideally only imposed on demerit goods, consumption of a good, right? Now think about this. What are demerit goods? We did talk about this. Processed fish will have GST and raw fish. Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Exactly. So the canned fish that you buy from the departmental store, that will say general sales tax or sales tax, and the raw fish that the companies are buying to process it and to sell it in the restaurants or whatever, right? That will have value added tax. Yeah, correct, right? Is to discourage consumption of demerit good. Now, what's a demerit good? So demerit good is anything that is harmful for the consumer, and that is also part of a syllabus. We'll talk about it. In fact, we'll look at the graph of demerit good after this, after we are done with indirect taxes and subsidies. So demerit good is a good that is harmful for consumers, but they do not fully realize the harmful effect, right? Demerit good is harmful for consumers, but they do not fully realize the harmful effect, and therefore they overconsume. Now, we already know a couple of examples of demerit goods, but since they do not fully realize the harmful effects, they overconsume the good. You good on this? Any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Okay, now students, think about this. Smoking, alcohol, all these products are demerit goods. Okay, now to stop people or to discourage, not stop completely, because even though there are taxes imposed on alcohol, cigarettes and all that stuff, people still consume it, right? But I mean, obviously there will be some people who will be discouraged, or at least they will use smaller quantities of these products. So that's the underlying reason why government imposes indirect taxes. Now, how indirect taxes operate, you have to look at this carefully. We have already covered it in the last class, right? But I mean, I'm just giving a quick recap to students who were not able to understand. Okay, now think about this. So let's say a packet of cigarette cost otherwise 100 rupees, let's say, right? A packet of cigarettes in Pakistan costs 100 rupees, right? So quantity of cigarettes, you will have quantity of cigarettes, right? Okay. On the x-axis, and you have price per packet on the y-axis. Now, first thing that you have to draw on the graph is simply the demand, market demand, how much is the demand for this product, and upward sloping will be your market supply. That will show how much is being produced. Easy, we go on this, students. Right. Now, let's assume that the government imposes a tax of 20 rupees per packet, right? So government wants to collect 20 rupees per packet of cigarettes, right? Now, and another thing that you need to remember is that government doesn't care who is paying the tax, either the consumers, who is facing the final burden of tax, right? So whether it's the consumers or the producer, right? So, but in most cases, the burden is split between consumers and producers. If a good is beneficial for you, but it's harmful for others, will it be a demerit good? If it's beneficial for you, give me an example. I mean, how come there could be a product which is beneficial for you, but harmful for others? That would be negative externality. When something has negative effect on the third party, that's negative externality. That's not part of our syllabus. You will study this in your A2, but think about this. But still, I'm curious to know what could be that example. Okay, now think about this. Students, creating air pollution. No, but that's not technically beneficial for you even, right? Because think about it, your car causing pollution will also harm you, right? Indirectly, because if there are more cars, think about it. My car, when I drive it on the road, it might be harming others more because I'm sitting inside the car, but obviously I'm not inside my car all day, right? I'm breathing in the same oxygen. I'm, breathing in the same air. So, I mean, but that's negative externality, to answer your question simply. right? No worries, right? Okay, think about this. But obviously, I totally get your point that it will benefit you in terms of at least the convenience that you get. That's why people use it, right? So yeah, I got your point. Okay, now think about this. So price of each packet of cigarettes at the moment is 100 rupees. Are we clear on this, right? And before government imposed indirect taxes, there were 5 million packets of cigarettes bought and sold, right? Because this is where the demand and supply are equal. Now, when government imposes indirect taxes, that increases the cost of production. I did tell you, right? So that increases the cost of production. So supply curve shifts to the left. That increases the cost of production and supply curve shifts to the left, right? Because think about this. Even before the final cigarettes are sold to consumers, producers have paid some part of the taxes to the government, right? So that is why it's increasing the cost of production. Students, are you getting me? Because students think, the one point that's a lot of students find confusing, that, okay, producers produce cigarettes, tobacco companies produce cigarettes, and then they sell it to consumers, and the consumers pay the tax. Then how is it increasing the cost for the producers? But in a lot of cases, producers have paid tax to government even before the product is sold to consumer. Are you getting me? That's why it's increasing the cost of production for producers, even before the product gets sold to consumer. How many of you are clear on this? Right? So when the cost of production increases, knowing the factors that affect demand and supply, we do know that the supply curve shifts leftwards whenever there's increase in cost of production, right? Okay, now when this happens, students, think about this. When this happens, your supply curve shifts to the left. When it shifts to the left, right, where will be the new equilibrium? The new equilibrium will be where the new supply intersects with your demand. So where the new supply intersects with your demand, this is the equilibrium point. So this becomes E2, right? So this was E1, original equilibrium, E1, original equilibrium, E2, new equilibrium. Now you connect the new equilibrium to the y-axis, and you label it as PC. What is PC? I'll tell you. PC is the price that consumers are paying. PC is the price that consumers are paying, right? Now let's assume consumers are paying 110 rupees. How much are consumers paying? 110. And how much was the tax which government imposed on each packet of cigarette? So government imposed a tax of 20 rupees per packet of cigarettes, per unit, right? Per packet of cigarette. Okay. Now what you need to do next is to bring the dotted line from the new equilibrium point to the old supply curve. You bring a dotted line down from the new equilibrium to the original supply curve, as you can see over here, and then you connect that point with the y-axis. And then you label it as PP. What is PP? PP is the price that producers will receive. PP is the price that producers will receive. So now if each packet of cigarettes is selling for 110 rupees in the market, consumers come to the shop, they pay 110, they take the packet of cigarettes. But not all of this amount is going into producers' pocket. Why so? Because they have to pay 20 from this amount to whom? They have to pay 20 rupees from this amount to the government, right? So technically, how much actually goes to producers' pocket? 90. Yes or no, right? So are you getting me? So the idea is that this is the graph that represents what happens when an indirect tax is imposed on the good. Any confusion? Right? And how much will be the new quantity? So you can see that the new quantity consumed in the market is something less than what it was previously. So perhaps the consumption might have dropped down from 5 million to 4 million packets per year, per month, whatever it is, right? We're going this. This is how indirect taxes work. Now, we will talk about that how much of the burden was faced by consumers and how much of the burden was faced by producers, right? Now, this is very important. This is a new thing. We didn't do this in the last class. Now, think about this. Now, students, you have to be careful. Now, before we get started on the graph, I did tell you that what is consumer surplus in the last class, like in the last unit, towards the end of last unit, we discussed two concepts, which is consumer surplus and producer surplus. Now, what is consumer surplus? Quickly, does anyone of you remember? What is consumer surplus? So consumer surplus was the benefit that consumers get from their participation in the market, right? And the way I explained it to you was, think about it. The difference between the consumers willing to pay and the actual market price that they pay. Very nice. Very good. Correct. So consumer surplus is the difference between consumers' willingness to pay, like how much they are willing to pay for a product, and how much they actually end up paying, which is the market price, this difference is known as consumer surplus. Now, let me explain you in simple words. If you think about the idea, right? Let's say someone comes to my economics class and that student has the willingness to pay of 8,000 rupees per month, right? That students think that this is a fair amount or this is what he or she can pay. So this is the willingness to pay 8,000 rupees per month. But when he comes to mega lecture classes, that student gets to realize, let's say, that the price that we charge per month is lower than this, right? Now, the difference between the two, this was the willingness to pay, WTP, right? And this is the market price, MP, let's say, market price, 7,000. So that student has saved 1,000 rupees per month. Yes or no? 1,000 consumer surplus, right? So we call consumer surplus as the benefit that consumers get from their participation in the market. It's kind of a benefit, a financial benefit, right? You saved 1,000 rupee because the market price was lower than your willingness to pay. So you can use this 1,000 rupee on some other product, right? Whichever product you want to buy, right? Similarly, what is producer surplus? So producer surplus is, think about this. It's the difference between the market price, how much is the price for each unit of the good, minus the minimum compensation to sell, minus minimum compensation to sell. Now, let me give you an example for this. So think about it. Minimum compensation to sell, right? Now, when you go to a shop to buy something, right? So let's say a pair of shoes, the market price of the pair of shoe currently is, let's say, 9,000 rupees, right? And the price at which the least price that producer wanted for that pair of shoe was, let's say, 7,500, right? Which obviously includes his profit. Do remember that the minimum compensation to sell is not just the cost. Why would you want to sell a product at the cost? So if I bought something for 5,000 and I sold it for 5,000, did I make anything out of it? Did I earn anything out of it? The simple answer to that is obviously no, right? So obviously when the producers decide the minimum compensation to sell, they have their some profit included in that. But let's say for some reason the market price has gone up and my market prices are higher than the minimum compensation to sell. So this 2,500 rupees on each pair of shoe is the benefit that producers received. Why? Because they got to sell their product at a price higher than this 9,000 is higher than what they wanted to sell it for, right? So this is what producer surplus is. Now, how do we show consumer and producer surplus on the graph? That's something that you have to understand, right? Now think about this. What you need to do is to, just a second, right? Let me stretch it a little bit like this. Okay, think about this. So okay, now what area represents consumer surplus on the graph and which area represents producer surplus on the graph? That's what I'm about to show you. Okay, now area below demand curve and above price. Area below demand curve and above price is your, right, consumer surplus. Now students, have a look at this. So which is the area below demand curve? So this was your demand curve, this D1, right? So this is where it intersects with the y-axis, right? And what was the price level previously? This much was the price level. So I'm telling you what was the consumer surplus before, right? So let's get rid of this extra stuff so that we have more space over here. Now, what we are doing here, students, we are looking on the graph that what was the consumer surplus before the tax was imposed, and then we will compare it what happened to consumer surplus after the tax was imposed, right? Why is that important? We'll get to see in a bit, right? Now, this was the price level initially when the original supply was intersecting with the original demand, right? Now, area below demand curve, right? Area below demand curve and above price, this was the price level, right? Area below demand curve and above price is your consumer surplus. So this entire big triangle was your consumer surplus. Students, are you following me or not, right? This entire big triangle was your consumer surplus. Now what happened? What is your new price level? The new price that consumers are paying is this much. The new price that consumers are paying is this much. Yes or no? PC. It's PC. Yes or no? Now, what will be the new consumer surplus? Area below demand curve and above price. So it will be this smaller triangle, right? It will just be this smaller triangle and not this whole bigger triangle that we had previously. We got on this? So what it actually means that the area of this trapezium, is the loss of consumer surplus. The area of this trapezium that I'm shading you, which was previously part of your consumer surplus, but now it's no more part of your consumer surplus. This is the loss of your consumer surplus. How many of you understood me? The area of this trapezium, this is the shape. This is how it looks like. If you didn't get much, so this is, I'm making it for you, right? So this is this thing, right? This is your loss of consumer surplus because it was initially part of your consumer surplus, but now it's not part of your consumer surplus anymore. We good? Any confusion? Anything that's not clear, right? Okay, now let's move on and let's look at producer surplus. Now I'll get rid of this first because then it might confuse you, right? Okay, now students, have a look at this. Let's get rid of this. Okay, now what should I choose? Let's choose the green color. Okay, now what was the producer surplus previously? Producer surplus was area above supply, right? So above supply and below price. This was the price that producers were previously receiving. This was the price that producers were previously receiving, right? This was the original price. Any confusion about it, students? Any confusion, right? So below price and above supply, right? So this entire, it isn't technically a full-fledged triangle, right? It's some other polygon, right? But okay, let me draw a neater one. Okay, now this entire region between these and these points, right? So this area here, right? This area here, in fact, let me use yellow color because that will differentiate, right? So this area, this entire area here was your producer surplus. Any confusion about it, right? Now what happened when government imposed indirect taxes? It's this price that producers are receiving now. It's this price, right? PP is the price that producers are receiving now. So your new producer surplus would be area below price and above supply. So it will be just this region. So this region, this trapezium here is the loss of your producer surplus. This trapezium here is the loss of your producer surplus. Students, are you getting? So let me share it for you. So this trapezium, which is exactly inverted of the other trapezium, right? So this other trapezium looks like this, right? It's the same shape, but it's inverted, right? This is the one, right? Students, is it making sense? Right? Now, the idea is that this upper trapezium was the loss in this yellow or purple one, right? This purple one was the loss in consumer surplus, and this lower trapezium is the loss of producer surplus. Are you getting any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Anything you want to ask me questions about, right? So this is loss of consumer surplus, this upper one, and this lower one is the loss of producer surplus. Now let's stop here and think about it theoretically. Let's think about it, what's happening theoretically. When government imposed this tax of 20 rupees per unit, that burden got split between consumers and producers. When government imposed an indirect tax of 20 rupees per unit, that got split between consumers and producers. Now government is getting the tax revenue from two groups. Students, are you following me? Now it is the consumers and the producers who are facing the burden of it. How do we know this? We can also verify it through the graph. Have a look at this, right? Now, previously consumers used to go to the shop, buy a packet of cigarettes for 100 rupees, and that 100 rupees was the total amount that used to go into producer's pocket because there was no tax. I repeat, before tax, consumers used to go to the shop, pay 100 rupees for a packet of cigarettes, and that 100 rupees used to go directly into producer's pocket because there was no amount of tax. There was no leakage. Government was not there to take some money. after taxes, what happened that consumers used to pay 110, which is 10 rupees higher than what they used to pay before. Now consumers are paying after tax 110 rupees, which is 10 rupees higher than what they used to pay previously. And producers are now receiving after tax. After tax, producers are receiving 90 rupees, which is less than what they used to receive before tax. Right? So both parties got affected, negatively affected. 10 rupees is being contributed by producers per unit, and 10 rupees is being contributed by consumers for each unit. And that makes a total of 20 rupees that goes into government's pocket, 20 rupees per unit of cigarettes. Now, government is getting better off, if you have to put it like this. Government is getting better off at the expense of whom? At the expense of producers and consumers. So government is getting better off at the expense of consumers and producers. Yes or no? Does it make sense? Right? So that is why your consumer and producer surplus is getting affected. Why? Because in both the cases, what is going up? Market price is going up in this case. And in this case, producers surplus, the market price that producers are now receiving is less. So by looking at the formula, just by looking at the formula, you can tell that when this goes up, willingness to pay is the same, market price is up. What will happen to consumer surplus? Consumer surplus will fall. And in the case of producer surplus, which is this formula, when market price is going down, because previously they used to get 100 rupees per packet, now they're getting 90 rupees per packet, and this being constant, right? Obviously your producer surplus will go down. Any confusion so far, right? So government is getting better off at the expense of consumers and producers. So loss of consumer surplus and loss of producer surplus is the proof that consumers are negatively affected and producers are negatively affected due to imposition of indirect taxes. Any confusion so far? It's the proof that consumers and producers are negatively affected due to imposition of, where should I write? Are negatively affected due to imposition of indirect tax. Any confusion? Right? Students, are you following me? And I did tell you that when consumer surplus is reducing, that means, when consumer surplus is reducing, this means consumers have had a negative effect of that thing. Similarly, when producer surplus is reducing, that means that producers had a negative effect of that policy, and vice versa. So when any of these two increases, let's say consumer surplus goes up, this means consumers are benefiting from the situation. When producer surplus goes up, it means that producers are benefiting from the situation, and so on, right? Now, one last thing before we move on to the subsidy graph. Which area on this graph represents the amount of tax collected by the government? Which area on this graph represents the amount of tax collected by the government, right? So let me get rid of this extra things, right? Can anyone of you guess? The amount of tax per unit was 20, right? Now you have to pay close attention. The amount of tax per unit is 20. What is the new quantity, right? How do you calculate the revenue? Think about this. So tax revenue should be equal to, it's simple maths, right? So how much tax the government collected if on each unit, the government is collecting a tax of 20 rupees per unit, and what's the new quantity that is being sold in the market? Because obviously per unit times the quantity, right? So it was 20 rupees per unit, and the new quantity was, let's say, 4 million. So you just do the maths, right? So 4 million, 24s are 100 million. So government will collect taxation worth 100 million rupees on taxes, or right? Sorry, is it 80? Sorry, my bad. How is it 100? It's 80, right? 80 million in revenue from the tax on cigarettes. Confusion? Now, if we look at it on the graph, so per unit is this amount, like the distance between these two. And what's the new quantity? The new quantity is this much. You can see 4 million, right? 4 million, right? Yes or no? So the area between the area of this rectangle, the area of this rectangle is what? The area of this rectangle is your amount of revenue that the government will collect from this thing. The area of this rectangle shows the amount of tax that the government will collect from this thing. Easy, students. So this is basically your amount of tax revenue that the government collects. You good on this, right? Okay, now let's quickly move on, right? And let's talk about the subsidies, right? Now, what are subsidies? Subsidies graph also looks similar, but obviously there's this difference between that. Okay, now subsidies are opposite of indirect taxes. Let's first understand what are subsidies and what's the purpose of imposing subsidies, right? So in the case of indirect taxes, government is collecting, government is collecting tax money from consumers and producers. In the case of subsidy, government is giving money to producers of a certain product, right? So let's say there is a company in Pakistan that is producing COVID vaccination. Now, if COVID vaccination is produced on its own, obviously the prices are simply based on the demand and supply for the good, right? Down sloping is the demand for the good, right? Let's say down sloping is the demand for the good, upward sloping will be the supply. And where the two are equal, that will be your equilibrium point. Easy, are you getting me? No rocket science, nothing complicated, right? So upward sloping is the supply, down sloping is the demand. Where the two graphs intersect, that will be the equilibrium point. Now, when government give financial payment, what does subsidy mean to be precise, what's the definition of subsidy? Subsidies are financial payments by government to producers of a certain product, right? Subsidies are financial payments to producers of a certain product, right? Now, this being said, think about it. When government gives subsidies, what happens? The cost of production is reduced, right? How does that reduce your cost of production? Because if previously producing whatever the cost of producing a product was, now not all of that cost is borne by the producers, right? Yes or no? So let's say if the total cost for any producer that was producing, let's say vaccination, was 100 million rupees, right? But on this amount, let's say government contributes 5 million in subsidies. Government contributed how much? 5 million. So technically, the actual expense that the producer had to make was only 95 million because this 5 million was kind of contributed by the government. Are you getting me? So opposite to what happens in indirect taxes, right? Where cost of production increases. In the case of subsidy, your cost of production would decrease. Confusion? Anything that's not clear, right? Now, when cost of production decreases, what happens to your supply curve? Friends, do you remember? Your supply curve goes in the opposite direction. So your supply will increase. We know this, right? So opposite to what happens in indirect taxes, the supply curve will shift to the right. Easy? Is everything clear so far? Is everyone clear? Okay, so the class is about to end. So quickly join with the new link and we'll quickly wrap this up in 7 minutes. And then we'll continue from tomorrow. But do join. Click on the same link.